Hello everyone, it's Professor Lopez once again. Today we're going to be going through Chapter 8, which covers environmental health and toxicology. We're going to be looking at how a variety of things that we create or are found in the environment can be lethal or harmful to either the human population or the environment as a whole. So here we have the learning outcomes for this chapter, kind of summarizing exactly what I just mentioned. We're going to talk about environmental health, about certain health risks that have arisen over the years, and how many of them are attributed to either environmental conditions or how many of them are just simply, disease-causing sicknesses. Now here's a quote by an individual named Seneca that says, "To wish to become well is a part of becoming well." And I kind of summarize what this chapter is all about, and that is, again, the overall health of not just the individual human being, but the environment and the world as a whole. So this chapter starts off very similar to other chapters and looks at a case study. And the question is asked, how dangerous is BPA? Well, first of all, what is BPA? BPA is a chemical known as bisphenol A, and it's a key ingredient of many plastics and epoxy resins, and it's one of the world's most widely used chemical compounds. In fact, in 2011, there was a total global production of about 3 million metric tons that was being used, and one of the biggest leaders in BPA usage was, of course, the more developed countries like China and even the U.S. Now, some of y'all might remember BPA seeming familiar, and that's because some of the modern companies today, like Apple, actually go out of their way to quote that BPA is not used as one of their materials for their products. And so it is a chemical that is pretty well known as of late. Now, what is BPA used for? It's used for things like baby bottles, automobile headlights, eyeglass lenses, and CDs, DVDs, and a lot of other things that, again, we come in contact with frequently. Now, we're going to find traces of BPA everywhere. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be bad for us, but it's when it becomes found in high amounts that it can actually become dangerous to us, because there have been linkages to a variety of defects and illnesses that have been linked to BPA. Some of the more common ones that were found in rodents, which have been, again, rodents aren't necessarily human beings, but we use them a lot as test subjects to see how they might react with us. So some of these sicknesses that have arisen due to BPA exposure is things like mammary and prostate cancer, genital defects in males, early onset puberty in females, as well as other things like type 2 diabetes and liver enzyme abnormalities. So again, this is just in rodents, but there's speculation that a lot of this could also be linked to human beings as well. So there's still a lot of research being done on how dangerous BPA truly is, but for now, you always want to err on the side of caution. So moving on to the next slide, we discussed environmental health. And just like with a human being, health is described as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, not just simply the absence of disease. Because as you know, somebody can be physically well, but then they might be struggling emotionally, mentally. So health covers a wide variety of things. And just like how a human body can succumb to things like disease and morbidity and mortality, environmental health also has to do with whether or not the earth can become ill. And now environmental health focuses on factors that cause disease, including elements of the natural, social, cultural, and technological worlds in which we live. And again, it's not just the ecology of the world, but it is the overall state of the world and all the things that could possibly affect. So here we see kind of an example of all the sources of environmental health risks, things like infectious agents, things that you might be familiar with, like bacteria and viruses. We understand those concerns, but some other ones that we might be a little bit less aware of are things like a variety type of pollutions. We all hear about smog in places like LA and China, so we're aware of air pollution, but we might not be aware that noise pollution is an actual thing, and that is living in places like New York, where you're constantly hearing airplanes, taxis, the trains, the subway, and that can actually become detrimental to an individual's health. Or even water. If you've been following the Flint, Michigan issue with their water, you know how important that is when it comes to affecting individuals. And so there's a variety of different sources that all play a role in environmental health. Now, the pollutions or the burdens that have fallen on this world have changed over time. In fact, even back as early in the 1900s, there were certain diseases that only afflicted those that were wealthy, because again, those that are wealthy can afford, excess, whether it be in food or in other luxurious items. But now we're starting to realize that even those that are part of developing countries that are not quite yet first world, they are starting to succumb to things like infections and complications due to maternal and prenatal birth, and even nutritional deficiencies or over nutrition. So again, this is all showing that there's a change going on in how the world is responding to a lot of global disease. And so here we see an image that shows how it's changed in 1990 to the expected rank in 2020 of what diseases are going to burden us as a world. And so you see here back in 1990, one of the number one leading causes of global disease was pneumonia. But that's been overtaken by heart disease, which used to be number 5. And that makes sense because as we, through the advent and spread of things like fast food restaurants and chains, it makes sense that heart disease would rise all the way to the top. But you see that even though there are some environmental issues here, the majority of global diseases are still related to communicable disease or disease that we can spread to one another. Things like HIV/AIDS and respiratory diseases and other viruses, things like that. So, and again, this first bullet here kind of summarizes what we just stated, and that is that even though there are such things as environmental issues, the majority of people that are dying are related to regular communicable diseases. And some of those diseases include things like diarrhea, malaria, measles, tetanus. And some of these, you might notice that there's already vaccines for some of these. Yet, despite the availability of vaccines, it does not mean that it's available to everybody. And of course, we even have issues like here in America where there are those individuals who choose not to vaccinate their children because they falsely believe that it's linked to things like autism. And so that's causing an uprise in things that should have already been eradicated, like measles and chickenpox. So again, we haven't seen those go away completely. And we still have a large number of children that are dying from preventable childhood disease. And again, it kind of goes back to what I just mentioned in regards to people not vaccinating their children, even though there are vaccinations for a lot of common illnesses. And so, things like scarlet fever are making a comeback. Things like polio are still around when they should have been completely eradicated. So again, I'm not here to tell you that you should be vaccinating your children, but it is a smart idea. And to further illustrate the point, there's still a lot of new pathogens that are coming out, that we hear about constantly. And even some old ones that have reemerged, things like Ebola. If you all recall, a few years ago, we had a big Ebola scare in the world, not just in Africa, which of course it was centralized there, but even here in America, where we had a couple of cases of people coming back from Africa with Ebola. So some of these pathogens are mutating and changing over time. And so we're still seeing a lot of loss of life from, disease-causing organisms. Now, one of the infectious diseases that's still prevalent and still kind of strong is malaria. It says here every year about 500 million new cases of this disease occur and about 1 million people die from it. Now, malaria is a regional disease. It is primarily found in Africa and other Asian countries, but there are some cases here in America still. So again, even though there are some preventative measures to prevent malaria, it's still a very strong infectious disease. And there are a few new ones that have surprised us over the years. Other than Ebola, we see new ones like H1N1. If you recall back in 2009 when people were really scared about H1N1 or the bird flu or the swine, the swine flu was, H1N1 and SARS a few years back. So we've seen some new infectious diseases that occur, and a lot of it is because of resistance to new medicines or certain diseases that were prevalent in certain animals have been able to cross over and jump to human beings. And now, obviously, this is not an immunology course or a bacteriology course, but just there's some basic understanding that you should have in that there are some diseases that are cross-species diseases, meaning they can jump from either a monkey to a human or vice versa, and of course other organisms as well. And so here we see an image showing the outbreak of infectious diseases over the last 20 or so years. And you see some that might seem familiar to you all, things like SARS, the bird flu, which was, of course, swine flu was a big one, Marburg fever in Africa, and even recently, 2012, we had chronic kidney disease, which was very prevalent in Central America. And some of these have already gone away, but there are some that are still pretty prevalent even to this day. And here's another example of a disease that tends to spread. It wasn't so prevalent here in America, and that is West Nile virus. Similarly to malaria, West Nile virus was pretty much kind of held in Africa, but of course, either due to mosquitoes that were brought over from Africa for study, or certain birds that migrated from Africa to America. We've seen over the last couple of years, and even here we've seen an image that shows just a year gap, there has been a spread of West Nile virus, as it's gone from New York and the eastern states to about almost all the lower 48 states. So it's just showing again how quickly these diseases spread. Now, just like with traditional human medication, there have been some ecological medications that have arisen. And what ecological medications really are is just ways that we can treat some of the problems that arise either in the wildlife or the ecology of certain areas of the world. So what we call this is we call these ecological diseases. And so these diseases have to be treated with what we call conservation medicine. It's just your conservation medicine attempts to understand how our environmental changes threaten our own health, as well as that of the natural communities on which we depend on for ecological service. Because again, when something in the ecosystem changes, it not only affects the birds, the animals, and the grass and the trees, but it will have an effect on us as human beings as well. Again, we see something as simple as water not being treated correctly in Flint, Michigan, how it affects many people with a variety of diseases, lead poisoning, cancer, because of, ecological disease. And here we see an example of some change that occurred in the ecology of, I believe it was in Australia, and how it led to a large, dramatic drop in the presence of certain frogs and toads. And what happened was there was a fungus that caused a certain form of mycosis and led to the drop of amphibian life throughout Queensland, Australia. And we see this a lot, not just with frogs, but we do see this a lot in other species and organisms as well, because either there's a change in the environment or because there's an introduction of a new threat to the environment. And what's happening to us as well is that just like with certain animals and certain bacteria, there's a lot of resistance that's growing. And it's for a variety of reasons, but one of the ones that's affected us the most the last couple of years is something you might have heard of, and that is MRSA, which stands for methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. Now, Staphylococcus aureus is a certain species of bacteria, but there are different strains that have arisen because they have become resistant to certain antibiotics. Now, why did that happen? Well, in the case of human beings, it's because we tend to over-medicate. Some of y'all may kind of agree with this, but in some cases, when you take medications, even if you cough, your mom or your dad might tell you to, hey, take this antibiotic, when you don't really probably need it, or you might be taking the wrong medication. And so by constantly taking antibiotics when you shouldn't be taking them, it leads your body to become resistant to these antibiotics, which therefore makes them harder to treat. And of course, a big reason why people also become resistant to certain antibiotics is because if a doctor prescribes you a 10-day regimen of antibiotics, most people will stop taking them like around day 5 because they feel better. But you really should be taking them to completion, because what ends up happening is you're not completely rid of your infection, and even if one single bacteria survives and becomes resistant to that antibiotic that you stop taking midway, it will become resistant to it and it will grow again, and the same antibiotic won't work again. And same thing's happening with a lot of other organisms that have been exposed to either a variety of pesticides. For example, back in the 50s, a certain pesticide called DDT was being used to kill a lot of pests in fields. And it was so overused that what ended up happening is, yes, you had a large loss of life with the pests that you want to get rid of. But the ones that did survive ended up becoming extremely resistant to DDT, and therefore that no longer was working as well. So here we see an image of how microbes or things like bacteria and viruses acquire antibiotic resistance. So here you see a large colony in part A, which shows mutation and selection of drug-resistant strains. As long as one survives, that's all you need is one to survive, it will then clone itself repeatedly, and now you have a brand new resistant colony that arose from one individual bacterial species. Another way that can happen is in part B is we have certain bacteria that can conjugate. You have to realize that most bacteria cannot reproduce sexually like human beings. There is no such thing as a male or female, and most bacteria reproduce asexually or make direct copies of themselves. However, some bacteria have the ability to share their genetic information via conjugation. They kind of link directly with another species of bacteria, and they will share their resistance, therefore creating a larger resistant colony. Now, the people that are being afflicted the most by these emerging diseases is, of course, those that are part of the poorer, percentage. It says here, the heaviest burden of illness is borne by the poorest people who can afford neither a healthy environment nor adequate health care. And this is pretty important. It says, who estimates that 90% of all disease burden occurs in developing countries? It's a large percentage. This is why you see a lot of countries like Africa. You've heard me say Africa maybe 2 or 3 times recently. And that is because that is one of the poorest countries in the world. And yet they seem to suffer the most from a variety of diseases and things like Ebola and HIV and AIDS and malaria and West Nile. And that is because a lot of them simply cannot afford to either vaccinate or take care of themselves properly or make prepare a suitable environment for them to live. And so luckily we have a lot of philanthropists like Bill and Melinda Gates who have pledged a lot of money and research to hopefully eradicate some of these diseases. But again, it hasn't been enough yet. So and even recently there's been a big debate here in America about healthcare. And the people that end up suffering the most without this government healthcare is, of course, those that cannot afford it. And so it all kind of is related, even though we live in different situations here in America and in Africa. Now, moving on to section 2 of chapter 8, we talk a little bit more about the effects of these toxic chemicals that occur in the environment and how they affect us. So, of course, at the very top, we see the term toxicology, and this is the study of the adverse effects of external factors on an organism or a system. Now, again, this does not refer just simply to human beings, but it can refer to plants and other organisms. So what we're talking about here is environmental chemicals such as drugs and as well as diet that can have large factors or play a large factor in your physical well-being. Some things that you might not be able to control are things like UV light and electromagnetic forces and radiation. These are all things that can also play a huge role in poisoning in the body. Again, some of y'all may be aware that if you have long exposure to sunlight, which is UV radiation, you can develop skin cancer. So, of course, there are remedies to that, wearing a lot of sunscreen. But there are some that we simply cannot control because, for example, we talked about BPA earlier. BPA, we can't control the fact that a lot of the products that we use are made with it, but we can somewhat choose to not use them. It says here, toxins often are harmful even in extremely dilute concentration. So what that means is that you might just need like a drop of the toxin and it still would cause damage as opposed to drinking a whole glass of it. And so what we're looking at here and how it relates to us in the environment is known as environmental toxicology. This specifically deals with the interactions, transformation, fate, and effects of toxins in the biosphere, including individual organisms such as ourselves, populations, and even whole ecosystems. So here we see a list of the top 20 toxic and hazardous substances. You see things like arsenic, lead, mercury. Some of these might seem familiar to you guys. And in case you don't know what these chemicals are, they do provide a list on the right that shows where you would find the majority of these sources. Now, personally, and this might seem unrelated, but I'm a huge Apple fan. I've had an iPhone since the first one came out. So, and I've always been one to watch a lot of the keynote presentations they have whenever they introduce a new product or an upgrade to a product. And one thing I've always noticed is that they always make sure to devote certain amount of time to telling the consumer that their product is devoid of any of certain chemicals like arsenic, like lead and mercury and PCBs and BPAs. And so, at first it didn't really mean anything to me, but now as I've, obviously been looking more at these environmental studies, you realize what role they play and why they're being stressed so importantly. And that is because, again, even in small doses, some of these can cause damage to the human body. Well, how do they affect us? Which leads us to, again, it's a good segue. And you got to realize that they affect us differently. Nobody is affected the same way because it all depends on things like your own immune system or your state of health. All these play a role in how these toxins affect us. But again, there are some toxins that will affect everybody the same way, regardless of how healthy or how sick you are. So there are some examples of toxins that you might not think of as toxins, but they do affect us. Things like allergens or antigens or even antibodies, which can kind of attack your own body as well. And this leads us to a term that's pretty interesting term, one that I had never heard of before, but it makes sense once I read about it, and that is called sick building syndrome. And it's a condition characterized by headaches, allergies, and chronic fatigue caused by poorly vented indoor air contaminated by various contaminants. Now, you might have experienced this if you work with certain kind of markers that have a very funky smell, or you're exposed to like rubber cement for a very long period of time, or even certain paints. If you're in a room that's not very well ventilated, you get sick. The fumes get to you, and that is what you call sick building syndrome. Now, a lot of materials that we use, things like plastic, wood products, insulation, and glue, they contain certain fumes that will get you sick if you're simply stuck in a room that is not very well ventilated. And that is an issue that still to this day causes harm to a lot of individuals. Now, there are other forms of agents that will get you sick. Some of them are identified as neurotoxins, or things that can play havoc on your nerves. Mutagens, which can lead to things like cancer and cause damage to our cellular DNA. Teratogens is another important one that I was personally made aware of back in my college days. And these are chemical agents that might play a role in causing birth defects. So a lot of pregnant women specifically have to be aware of things like called teratogens. And doctors will always tell you what things you should avoid and for what reason. And then lastly, there are other agents that are simply called carcinogens. And as their name implies, they're called carcinogens because they lead to the formation of cancer. Now, one of the more frequently quoted things that you have to worry about in the book is known as endocrine hormone disruptors. The endocrine system plays a huge role in your body because it is responsible for your growth, for puberty, and for all hormones that you elicit throughout your body. And you know that hormones are very important because they don't just stimulate the sexual side of an individual, but they also stimulate a lot of things like in women contraction. They stimulate certain sensations within the body. So they're very important. Now, there are some chemical agents out there that can disrupt, as the name implies, the endocrine system. Things like DDTs and PCBs. They interfere with normal growth and development, and even in low doses, they can still play a large role in the human body and other animals as well. Some of the more common ways that it can affect a human is that it can actually wreak havoc in your reproductive health. In some cases of men, they become what they call feminized because it kind of slows the growth of their testes and other hormones in their body. So it can have a detrimental effect in some individuals. And so here's a breakdown of what's happening. So the fact that it was called a endocrine hormone disruptor is what it's saying is, in our cell we have a variety of receptors and bonding agents. So these receptors are kind of like a glove, and the estrogen compound in this case are like the ball that's being thrown into the glove. When something matches, it kind of signals and turns on a cascade of pathways. But when an endocrine hormone disruptor comes in, it blocks that pathway, therefore kind of changing the whole outcome of whatever that hormone was supposed to do. And that's why it's dangerous, because sometimes it can go all the way even to the nuclear level, therefore causing nuclear damage and leading to mutations, which can then of course lead to cancer. So again, it's something that you might not have to really know too much right now, but if you ever pursue the medical field or something similar to that, you will have to learn about how disruptors receptor blockers are very important in the human body. Now, moving on to section 3 of chapter 8, we now move on to what's known as the movement and distribution and fate of toxins. And what we're going to realize is that how important a toxin is has a lot to do with, how much you're exposed to, for how long are you exposed to it, and of course, how big is it? Is it a large dosage, and how stable is it? And we're going to see a lot of these terms in a little bit. And so here we see a lot of the factors that play a role in what we know as environmental toxicity. And some of these I just finished mentioning it, but some of them have to do with physical characteristics. Others have to do with how long you're exposed to it, and of course, some of it has to do with how your body responds to the toxin itself. Are you going to absorb it pretty easily, or does your body have a mechanism to get rid of it, therefore not affecting you too much? All that plays a role in environmental toxicity. Now, one of the more common characteristics that you have to be aware of when it comes to whether or not you're going to become poisoned is how soluble is the chemical agent. If it's something that's water soluble, it means that it's something that can be dissolved easily in the water. And again, I mentioned it earlier, but we look back at the Flint, Michigan water crisis. A lot of it had to do with chemicals that were being dumped in the water. Therefore, they were water soluble chemicals, which were being drank, and of course, leading to a lot of sickness in the human body. Now, if it's a fat-soluble compound, then of course that's a little bit harder. You need some kind of vector or carrier to be able to get it into the human body. But it's not to say that they're not very dangerous. They're still dangerous. They're just transferred in a different technique. Secondly, here, as I mentioned before, exposure and susceptibility are also huge factors in how you're going to respond to toxins. Is the chemical agent something that you need to be exposed for a very long time? Or is it something that's super potent and you only need a small drop to be exposed to it? All those play a role in how long you need to be exposed to a certain contaminant or chemical agent. Another way is how are you going to come in contact with it? Is it airborne? Is it waterborne? Is it through direct contact? How is it going to be spread? Again, there was, when HIV and AIDS became a thing in the 80s, people were not aware of how they spread. So some people were super scared to even shake hands with somebody who had HIV AIDS. Now, of course, we realize that it can only be passed along through actual fluid contamination. Like if they had a cut and you had a cut and your bloods, exchanged, then yeah, you might be susceptible to HIV AIDS or through sexual intercourse with another way. But, just simply talking to somebody, shaking their hand, giving them a hug, does not expose you to HIV or AIDS. And so that also plays, it's an analogy to how these toxins work with the human body as well. And so here we see a chart or a diagram that kind of shows us a variety of ways that we can become exposed to different chemical agents or foreign agents, things like drinking water or even certain foods that we eat. That's how we get food poisoning. Of course, others are medicinal, others are airborne. So again, we can obtain contact with toxin in a variety of ways. Now, of course, here we see kind of like a food pyramid, if you want to call it that, a food chain. And this leads to two terms that we call bioaccumulation and biomagnification. Now, bioaccumulation refers to the fact that organisms may selectively absorb and store toxins in their bodies. So something like this very small critter down in the bottom of the ocean might accumulate some toxins in its body, but it won't affect it too much because it's very small. But if you continue going up the food chain, it becomes biomagnified, which occurs when the toxic burden of a large number of organisms at a lower trophic level is accumulated and concentrated by a predator at a higher trophic level. So as this toxin keeps getting passed up the food chain, it becomes more magnified, so that by the time it reaches the top of the food chain, in this case the seagull, that toxin will then become lethal to the human or to the top species, in this case the bird. And that can actually happen to us as well. We might eat something that maybe wasn't affected by a toxin, but then of course once it gets to us, it can be very lethal. Now, another thing that can be detrimental to how we react to toxins is something known as persistence. Most things that we create nowadays have a very what they call a short shelf life, meaning they tend to degrade very quickly. Therefore, the toxin will die out with the substance that degrades. But in some cases, there are some materials that can become very persistent, and they can last for a very, very long time. And so that means that the toxin can last as well. And some examples of that, of course, are heavy metals like lead and mercury. We all know that if we're exposed to lead for a very long period of time, or even mercury, that can kill us. And so those do not really degrade over time, so they can continue to be dangerous even if after 20 or 30 years. And of course, other compounds such as PVC plastics and chlorinated pesticides can also play a large role in affecting the human population. Now, the more that we interact with some of these chemicals, the more toxic they can become, because what ends up happening is maybe an individual chemical might not be too bad to the human population, but when it becomes added on to something else, then it will increase its toxicity. So it says here, some materials produce antagonistic reactions, that is, they interfere with the effects or stimulate the breakdown of other chemicals. Okay, for example, when vitamin E and A react, they can reduce the response to some carcinogens, and so again, that's an antagonistic reaction. In some cases, we have what we call additive reactions, where other materials, when they add up together with something else, they actually increase exposure. And in some cases, we have synergism, which is an interaction in which one substance exacerbates the effects of another. Okay, so a good example of that is, if somebody's been exposed to asbestos, that's not good for the lungs. You can definitely cause lung issues. But if somebody has been exposed to asbestos and also smokes at the same time, they are much higher. They have a much higher risk of getting cancer or some illness than somebody who is just exposed to one of the agents, whether it be smoking or asbestos. So that's what it means when something is synergistic. So what can we do to minimize the effects? Well, in some cases, like I mentioned before, we don't really have to worry about it because these can only become lethal in large doses. For example, caffeine is known to be, it can be dangerous. Of course, everybody, most people drink coffee without any problems, but if you were to somehow drink 100 cups of strong coffee, you could die. But when do we ever see someone drinking 100 cups of coffee in a single day, much less a week? And so again, some of these can be toxic, but only in large amounts. Same thing as it says here, similarly, 100 aspirin tablets or 22 pounds of spinach or a liter of alcohol would be deadly if consumed all at once. But again, if you're drinking a liter of alcohol, then you're making bad life decisions. But we don't really see that happening too much. So in some small doses, some of these toxins can be broken down. Another similar one that I always thought was kind of funny, but was eating peanuts. Peanuts contain small traces of cyanide, and if you all have heard of that term before, cyanide is a toxin. It's in some spy movies, people will take cyanide pills to kill themselves rather than be interrogated. Well, peanuts have cyanide, but they're in such small amounts that we can eat peanuts and be okay. However, if you were to eat like a tub of peanuts in a single day, then yeah, you might die from cyanide poisoning, if not from something else. But so you really need these in large doses for them to cause detrimental effect. And a lot of it is because we excrete these toxins. Given enough time, we degrade them, we break them down, and of course we either excrete them through our urine, or we defecate them out, or we sweat them out. Sometimes when you see people that have gotten some kind of poisoning, sometimes they have to simply sweat it out, and it'll come out of their body. So again, it's just kind of further shows that some toxins can be eliminated through simple, small doses. And of course, our body has means of repairing itself, even at the cellular level. We have things like lysosomes and peroxisomes, which are very important organelles in our body that are meant to kind of rid ourselves of waste that could be lethal to the body. Of course, given enough time and given enough exposure, that can wear down our cells, and we can, of course, become, really hurt by some of these toxins over time. So we talk about, some toxins need to be had in large amounts, but how do we measure the toxicity of a toxin? Again, some are going to be very small doses, some are going to be very large doses. So how do we measure that? And that's what the most basic principle of toxicology is measuring how toxic something is. And of course, we need to also take into consideration how that toxic substance is being delivered, okay, and of course how much it's going to react with other agents. And so most toxins that we're aware of have been tested on lab animals. Of course, the most common animal that's been tested is the lab rat. And so we commonly look at the lab rat or rabbits or something similar to that to see how we as human beings will react to certain products. So even something as simple as shampoo or body soap, a lot of times gets tested on lab animals to see what kind of effect it'll have on us. Now, the downside to that is, again, these rodents are not human beings. We're not built the exact same way. Yes, we are mammals. We share some similarities to a rodent, but we are not rodents, and they are not us. So how much can we really trust these tests that are being done in the laboratory? And a lot of scientists have agreed that rodents can play a good role in determining how a human would react to certain substances or toxins, but again, there's still a few out there that don't really trust it. Okay, and so one of the things that complicates these tests is what's something known as toxic sensitivity between individual animals. And so probable variation in sensitivity to a toxin arise within the population. Some members of a population may be sensitive to a given toxin, while others are much less sensitive. And so again, how true are the results that we're getting? Can we really trust them? And so what we look at something known as dose response curve to help us determine toxicity. So your convenient way to describe toxicity of a chemical is to determine the dose to which 50% of the test population is sensitive. So once the average or the 50% of certain groups of species of animals become sensitive to the toxin, then that's when you know that that's a toxic level, and that's what we call the lethal dose, or the LD. Okay, LD50, and you might see some of these in certain medicinal drugs that tell you what is considered to be lethal. Some will tell you don't ever take more than 4 pills in a day because it may lead to death. So how did they determine that? Well, they had to figure out the lethal dose of a given toxic or a given drug. And as I mentioned before, there's a wide range of toxicity. And so because of that, we have to create kind of different categories of substances and determine how toxic they are. Some are extremely toxic, some are very toxic, and some are super toxic, meaning there are certain chemicals that we only need a drop or a millionth of a gram, a microgram, for it to be a lethal dose. So one of the most common toxic chemical known to man is ricin, and it's a protein found in castor bean seeds, and it's so poisonous that 0.3 billionths of a gram can, if it's given intravenously to a mouse, will kill it. And so it's very dangerous. And so you might have heard of ricin as well, and it's used a lot in warfare as well. So it's a very dangerous substance. Now again, some people or some organisms will respond differently to certain toxic. Some of them will have an acute effect, meaning it's very instantaneous, and they only need to be exposed one time for them to have immediate reaction to the toxin. While some will have to be spread over a long term, therefore we call them chronic toxins. These are long lasting and sometimes permanent. And so what's going to happen is you're being exposed repeatedly to a certain toxin. Therefore, it might lead to problems long term. And so here we see how low doses can have variable effects. We see how, again, some doses will react almost instantaneously. That's what we call the acute reaction. While some will be kind of chronic and it'll take a while for them to really have an effect on the species that you're working with. Now we're moving on to section 6 of chapter 8, and we get to talking about how detectable levels aren't always dangerous. So here, 20 years ago, parts per million were generally the limits of detection for most materials, but now we can detect parts per trillion or even parts per quadrillion in some cases. And that's because as technology increases, so do the tools that we use to measure these substances. Therefore, we're actually finding out what are the actual true levels where something would be toxic. And we see I've seen that term part per million a lot when it comes to things like using chlorine in the pool. How much is too much? How little is too little? So thanks to these new advancements in measuring techniques and measuring tools, we're able to really figure out how much of a toxin we can actually bear when it comes to whatever it is that we're testing. And so, as previously mentioned, low doses can have variable effects. It's going to be very responsive to certain species and non-responsive to others. And of course, how much of the dose do you really need? And how low is low? All these are questions to be asked when studying the effects of certain toxins on either rats or rodents or rabbits or even human beings. Okay. So ultimately, what it boils down to is, risk assessment and acceptance. Risk is the probability of harm times the probability of exposure that chemical is released into the environment. And some of it can be chemical risk. Some of them are just risks that we take in everyday life. We have to determine, is the risk worth it? And that's what I mean by acceptance. Our perception of risk isn't always rational. A number of factors influence how we perceive relative risks associated with different situations. This is here people with social, political, or economic interests tend to downplay certain risks and emphasize others that suit their own agendas. And this is kind of plays into something that happened just recently. If you follow politics, which right now, the political atmosphere has been very, very, what's the word I'm looking for? Very sensitive, I guess. That President Trump and his administration undid the Clean Power Plan, which is something that President Obama had put into effect. And what the Clean Power Plan was designed to do was to try to eliminate a lot of carbon waste into the atmosphere by 2030, I believe it was. And so, they were trying to focus more on renewable energies, getting rid of, waste dumping into streams and just putting a lot of regulation. Well, of course, President Trump undid that. One of the first things he did was he allowed coal plants to start dumping into their nearby streams. And so they did it on the grounds that by having all these regulations, you stifle the economy. And so because of their economic interests, they're downplaying the risk of dumping this waste into rivers and streams, or downplaying the risk of allowing certain pipelines to be built through water or streams or through certain lands where they might be kind of sensitive to large drilling like that. And so again, people will weigh risk differently, and it's not to tell you that one is right or the other one is wrong, but it's to show you how people think differently. Obviously, President Obama figured that polluting our water streams was dangerous and very risky, while President Trump seems that he thinks that by having these regulations, you stifle the economy and you kill jobs. And so again, you can have your own stance on that, but it is kind of showing differing views of risk. And here's a good example how risky is skateboarding. To a parent, skateboarding might be super risky, while to a teenage male who wants to have fun and test fate, skateboarding might not be very risky, or it might be worth the risk. Which leads us to the question: how much risk is acceptable? How much is it worth to minimize and avoid exposure to certain risks? Most people will tolerate a higher probability of occurrence of an event if the harm caused by that event is low. If you knew that skateboarding on a pipe at the worst was going to leave you a bruise, you might say, "Oh, it's totally worth it." But if you knew that, again, you're skateboarding on an incline and you might break your head, then you might say, "Well, no, maybe not. That's not worth it." And so the EPA, which of course is at risk of getting cut under this current administration, generally assume that a risk of 1 in 1 million is acceptable for most environmental hazards. For activity that we enjoy, we're often willing to accept far greater risks than this general threshold. And so here we see relative risk of death from various causes. So we see, for example, at the very top is heart disease, and the odds are 1 in every 2. So it means about 50% of people have a chance of dying of heart disease. It's a very high risk. Cancer is 1 in 3. Smoking, 1 in 4 will die from smoking-related illnesses. And we see that it keeps going down and down and down and down. 1 in 1 million will die from botulism, which is a bacterium that can cause extreme stomach ailments. 1 in 5 million will die from falling space debris, and 1 in 10 million will die from drinking water with EPA limit of trichloroethylene. So again, different risks for different types of events, and everybody weighs up differently, I'm sure. And this leads us to this last section, which talks about how a lot of these risks tends to lead to the creation of public policy or laws that are designed to combat these risks. It says here, risk management combines principles of environmental health and toxicology with regulatory decisions based on socioeconomic, technical, and political considerations. And so a good example of that is something that I just mentioned, and that is the Clean Power Plan. What President Obama did was he was using risk management of environmental health and was trying to use regulatory laws to, bring that risk down. But in doing so, he was also messing with socioeconomic considerations. So, this is why it's being undone by the current administration. Now, you have to be very careful, of course. You can't just start putting laws for everything, though. One example of this is back in the 70s, the chemical known as saccharin, which some of y'all might be familiar with that, which it's used in alternative sweeteners like Sweet and Low. It was considered to be dangerous because a study had shown that there were certain mice that had gotten bladder cancer due to increased amounts of saccharin. However, when further research was done to this, and of course this led to the law that banned saccharin, but when other researchers started looking into this, they realized that, well, of course these mice were getting cancer because they were given the equivalent of 800 cans of diet soda per day per injection. So when they started realizing, like, okay, never mind, saccharin might not be that dangerous because it was only dangerous when it was given in extremely large amounts. So they undid that law because that law wasn't really necessary. And so that's where the trick is where when you figure out if something should be a law based on research that is out there and how valid is that research. And of course, that's always left to every individual's perception. And so here we see a Venn diagram that kind of shows, risk assessment versus risk management. And again, a lot of this really, you see a lot of arrows pointing to each other, and that is because a lot of these are related. These regulatory decisions can be affected by political, technical, socioeconomic factors, and how we characterize the risk will vary according to who's looking at the risk. Okay. And so that concludes this chapter. Again, make sure that you look at the assignment for this week that has a lot to do with toxicity as well as how it affects the human population. And best of luck in the next chapter.